Now a 12 News investigation exposes tax exemptions claimed by some religious organizations that raise questions of good faith.
And Colleen Henry reveals the cost to taxpayers.
Welcome to my abode.
For 4 months, he wrote rent checks to a coworker.
And that's for 1 month, 2 months.
He's asked us not to identify him since the arrangement ended in an ugly eviction. That's when he looked up the property records and was stunned to learn who really owned his duplex.
This is not right. The property owner of assessment record, Calvary Hill Temple Apostolic Faith Church Incorporated. What?
Calvary Hill Temple Apostolic Faith rents space from another church in Brown Deer. It got tax-exempt status for this house from the city of Milwaukee. That means it pays no property taxes.
You don't pay property tax on this? Because I live here.
12 News found his coworker at home in the lower level of the duplex. Janetta Parker Perry drives for the same bus company as her tenant, but she's also the pastor at Calvary Hill Temple Apostolic Faith Church. She told us she rented the upper to be charitable.
Said he came to me, and what we do, we help people. Since he didn't have a place, he was staying in a hotel somewhere.
State law does allow churches to avoid property taxes on the homes where their pastors and ministers live.
If you rent this place out, you have to pay property taxes on the rented portion. Well, that comes from in March. When I go back down there in March, I'll let them know.
Oh, we're from Channel 12. We're looking for Word of Faith Ministries.
The church next door.
12 News found another church-owned tax-exempt property rented out.
This house still is owned by the church?
Mm-hmm.
The renter's daughter was at home.
So she doesn't work for the church?
No.
Okay. She just pays rent to the church?
To the pastor himself.
She says the rent is $700.
Hi, you Pastor Walker?
Yes.
12 News found the pastor at his church next door.
I understand you're renting that house.
The pastor showed 12 News his tax-exempt application and offered an explanation the city says is wrong.
And so long as we use part of the income for rehab of the property, then it's not taxable.
And it doesn't matter how you use the rent. The fact is it's not being used for an exempt purpose.
Milwaukee's assessor says churches don't have to pay taxes on homes where their ordained ministers live or where they do outreach, but they can't collect rent if they're taking the tax break. Though 12 News has learned there is no one in charge of policing them.
So this is basically the honor system?
Well, it's a little bit of the honor system, I guess. We do find out, we have appraisers out in the field, and they notice things all the time that we recheck out. We have people that call in and ask about certain exemptions, and we'll check those out.
Reevy says every dollar lost to the religious exemption is an extra dollar paid by taxpayers, and the cost is stunning. Fully 25% of Milwaukee's assessed property falls under the religious exemption, including nearly 100 miscellaneous tax-exempt religious properties across the city.
We have at least $5.5 billion worth of non-governmental exemptions.
That includes nonprofits, churches, and religiously affiliated hospitals. She believes most churches follow the rules.
I don't think there's a lot, but are there, a few examples? I would say it probably is similar to someone who has a basement rec room that they haven't taken a permit out for. To me, it's the principle of the thing. If you're not exempt, then you should be paying your fair share like everybody else.
The assessor says the city will now send investigators to the rental properties 12 News identified, and if the churches owe taxes, they'll have to pay up. But the law does not assign penalties in these cases, and it limits the city to collecting just 2 years in back taxes, Craig.
But Colleen, the churches are freely allowed to rent those properties.
Sure, they can rent the properties, but if they plan to do so, they need to tell the city first, and they do lose their tax exemption on that space.
Schools and churches, hundreds of Maryland properties are tax exempt, but what about the multi-million-dollar homes? ABC 2 News investigator Josie Sperman explains why those who pray to a higher power don't have to pay a dime in property taxes.
It's a bill most of us dread, even though we've come to accept it.
Well, we have to pay taxes to support our municipal services.
It's support that's based on the size of your home. The state makes an assessment and you send in a check. So you'd expect that with a house this big, or even this big, they'd be paying a ton to cover the tax tab. What do you think they pay?
Maybe 20 grand a year?
They pay nothing.
No way. How's that possible?
The owners of this $2.1 million mansion in Lutherville don't pay a dime in property tax. Neither do the people who live behind the gates of this $2.6 million estate in Upper Marlboro.
God bless them.
Well, he already does, because these multi-million-dollar homes are tax exempt. They're parsonages.
It's the house that's furnished to a minister by an identifiable religious congregation for use by that minister.
And while there are hundreds of these houses here in Maryland, only 5 are worth more than $1 million.
The value of the property raises a question in anyone's mind.
We had plenty of questions, too, because when it comes to the home for a man of God, the sky's the limit.
No one ever thought it was probably necessary to have a dollar limit on the amount of parsonage.
The state never set a cutoff, but some think it's necessary now.
People are living in very, very expensive homes. There's no tax being paid. There's no services being supported.
And Baltimore City Councilman Carl Stokes says with the state's current financial crisis, there's far less room for free rides. Stokes wants to keep churches tax exempt, but for your sake, he says it's time their leaders send a little something to the state's collection plate.
We're going back to the same people and asking them to pay more out of their pocket for less services, frankly.
But even if you're cutting back, some religious leaders aren't pinching pennies. According to tax records, religious exemptions totaled nearly $8 billion in 2008, and a chunk of that came from parsonages, both big and small.
The police still come to that property. If there's a fire, the fire truck doesn't stop at an imaginary line.
But when it comes to drawing the line, many people have no problem with pastors getting an exemption, no matter what size home they live in.
They serve God, so I would say that would be fair.
But whether it's fair is not a question for a higher power, but for those in power in Annapolis. Josie Sturman, ABC 2 News Investigators.
Councilman Stokes plans to lobby lawmakers for a cap next session. Now, keep in mind, here in Maryland, a tax exemption for parsonages is not guaranteed or mandatory. Many churches, including those with parsonages above the $1 million mark, choose not to apply, and some who are applying are not granted these exemptions. Now, as for the exempt homes that we featured, we asked the leaders of those churches for comment. Not only the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. responded, saying the Potomac home we showed is a rectory that borders a Catholic church, and that Catholic priests live on church property wherever it's located, whether it's in poor or wealthy areas. And you want to know more about these tax-exempt homes? We've put a slideshow together on our website that tells you how big they are, how much they're worth, and how much their neighbors pay in property taxes. Why don't you go to abc2news.com right now? You'll find it in the Investigators section.